Welcome to the next video on developing our web framework. In this video we're going to be looking at designing with CSS, particularly CSS3. So what we'll do in this video is we'll pick up from where we were last time. We'll have a little look at things like separation of concerns and remind ourselves about how that applies and why it's so important. We'll look at the basic principles of CSS and how it applies to our little mini web framework. And as we do that, we'll look at some of the issues that arise out of that. So by the end of the last video, we were looking at the basic structure for an HTML5 page, and we noted that what it produces looks pretty poor. And we reminded ourselves that that's fine because the content is fine, or it would be when it's filled in with real content rather than skeleton stuff. But it's the presentation we don't like, and what we want to do is to push all of the presentation into the CSS. So first of all, we need to think a little bit about CSS versions. CSS is widely used in web design, probably virtually everywhere, and CSS3 is talked about and partially implemented. We might ask the question, what happened to CSS2? But actually it's not like HTML versions. So new CSS standards add functionality, and as time goes by, some old CSS definitions are, as it's called, deprecated, so they might still be interpreted by browsers, but one is advised to avoid them. But in general, the changes are seamless, so we don't have to declare which version of CSS we're using. So basically we just use a CSS style sheet and make sure that we're using definitions that will work as widely as possible. It's good to think about how do I use a CSS. So if we go back to the HTML page and note in the head section, we at the moment just have title/title. We need to include in there a link line that says where we can find the CSS file. And it looks like this as we got it on the slide here. So it's a link, and it has rel equals, and then it tells it that it's a style sheet. The type is text CSS, and then you give it the reference. It's that reference bit that's important. So notice that I've declared that it's going to be in a subdirectory called library, because it's good to have stuff like that in a separate directory, and I've called it the library subdirectory because why not? And I've called the CSS sheet webpage.css. So we need to create, having put that into our HTML and saved it, we then need to create the library subdirectory. We need to create a text file in the library subdirectory and call it webpage.css, which currently is blank. So if we use that and then start to look at our page, it's made no difference, of course, because there's no information in the CSS file. But we can now start editing the webpage.css and making the page look decent. So on our little example website, I'm leaving page1.html and page2.html as they were, so we can see a bit of progression going on there. And I'm creating a page3.html, which is more or less the same. There's one or two tweaks, but it's still ugly. We have now linked it to the CSS file, but the CSS is empty. So let's now get to work editing the CSS file to tell it to make the site look better. We'll start by prettifying the header. We'll give the header a grey background with a white text, as we got here on this slide, and that means that our CSS will now change our web page to look like this example here. Now we've got that done, let's make the navigation bar light grey to contrast with the darker grey of the header. We'll add vertical bars either side of the menu selectors. That's an awful decision. I can't think why I did that, but hey, I don't want to go back and change all the stuff, all the materials for the sake of this video. Maybe next year, but for now we'll leave it awful. Okay, we'll change it as well later in some of these examples later on. We'll make the footer text grey and in italic. So if we have a look at all of that, on this slide now we can see the CSS that we've produced to achieve that, and we can see the result here as well. Now it's still looking pretty untidy, so let's puff the boxes up so that they look like they belong together, and let's tidy the text up as well. Here's the CSS file with these changes added in, and we can see how that makes the actual web page look different when it's displayed in a web browser. Okay, now we've got that more or less sorted out, we ought to have a little look at how we cope with wide screens. So our little web page looks fine on a narrow display, but it looks horrid on a wide screen. Now I'll just give a little aside here, because there are lots of sites that don't think about the fact that we now have hugely wide screens available to us in our widescreen video display devices that we have around now. And when you get a very wide screen, if you only have one column as we've got, this now starts to look horrible, because the text is so wide your eye can't scan it just sweeping downwards. You have to scan left to right. It makes it quite tiring and very slow to read. So you really should restrict the width of a column of text to a particular width. I'm not sure if it's if there's some standard about exactly what the width should be, but I would say that on my sites, if I'm using a single column, maybe with gutters left and right, I find a maximum screen width of about 850 pixels with a column of 100 pixels roughly each side feels about right for something that is easy to read. So that's what I'm heading for in this. That's the aside. So we can now go in and restrict the width of our different elements in our website, but we've got 4 separate ones. We've got header, nav, section and footer. And yes, we can start going through and changing all of them, but that's a bit of a pain. It would be much better if we put them all in one big container section. Unfortunately, CSS3 doesn't have a container element. That's a bit of a nuisance, especially bearing in mind that a large number of sites out there actually use a container element. We could in HTML5 define our own container element, but it gives us a problem later on because it won't then validate in the W3 checker. So what we'll do is we'll use the CSS3 main element and we'll use that as our container. It's a bit of a fudge and I'm not overly comfortable with it. If it's a container, we should call it container. That's the whole point of semantic transparency. But we haven't got that at the moment. Yes, we could define it, but there's issues with that. So, okay, let's have a look at what this will look like. Here's our slightly modified page design. As we had before, we've got header, nav, section and footer, but they're now all contained in main. In this diagram here, main looks like it has a massive great border around it. We won't do that. Main won't be visible at all. It will just use it as an invisible container into which the other 4 slot. Now we have a slight problem because we have in fact not just changed the style, we've changed the actual semantic structure of our page. So we do need to go back and modify the HTML because we're changing the semantic structure. So we'll use the main element and insert it around the active elements as a container, as we've got in this bit of code here. Now we need to go back to our CSS and we need to define main. And we can declare that it's got a maximum width, we can add some background colour to the page to make the container stand out, and we can round the edges of the display block so that it looks nice. So our code now looks like this. And we have success. If we look at this, if we display our page in a narrow browser, it displays fine. If we display in a wide browser, it still looks fine. And if we display in a very wide browser, it restricts the width of the text to a readable width, which is much more pleasant than going full screen. So now we can see the power of CSS. We have gone from a very plain presentation to something that one could say is reasonably acceptable. That's arguable. The menu to me still looks horrible, but that was my bad decision early on with that. So the point is, the CSS, a single CSS file, has made all the difference in terms of presentation. So I can live with that as a reasonable, simple design. It works well on wide screens, it works on narrow screens, so it has the beginnings of responsive design. We'll revisit that later. But there's nothing in our CSS to say what the code is about. That is not good news. It is short, so we don't want to get too distracted at the moment, and I wanted to leave it so that we could get an overview of the code, so I didn't want to be distracted with comments as we went through. But we do now need to go back and add the comments. So for now we'll at the very least top and tail our code. So in this slide you can see how I've added the comments in. I'm using a particular style for commenting, and there's a reason for that. It will tie in when we come to PHP doc later with the standards that PHP doc demands. For now we'll just see that we've got the block of text there giving a simple explanation of what this CSS file is called and is about, a slightly longer description saying a bit more about it, and it states who the author was, what version it is. I tend to use date and time for version because it's a simple way of versioning, and we don't need to have, but it's not a bad idea to have a copyright statement in there, which I've got as well. Really, you want something in there that will denote the version and that will identify the author, so that when the file goes walkabout on the internet, someone knows something about it. Now, before we finish, we should check out our handiwork. We can use the W3C Checker for CSS, and if we put our code, our CSS code, or our page actually, through the validator, we'll find that the CSS validates straight off. So we have been successful in achieving a basic design. We have the content and semantics entirely in the HTML file. We have the aesthetic stuff entirely in the CSS, so we have achieved our separation of concerns. That will be extremely important as we go through. Our next task is to consider Object PHP.